All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Ian, in case you forgot. Sorry I couldn't be in class this week. I do regret missing everyone's great presentations, but I had some family business I quickly needed to attend to. I'm going to start my time right now. So my micro-macro journal club is how the sloth's fur, micro and macro biomes reinforce risky behaviors within the sloth. The article title is "A Syndrome of Mutualism Reinforces the Lifestyle of a Sloth," specifically three-toed sloths. It comes from the Proceedings of the Royal Society in Biological Studies, and it was peer-reviewed and published in 2014. These are all the authors in case you're interested. Let me first set the scene. We know that three-toed sloths climb down a tree once a week just to poop and climb back up. Despite their extremely low metabolic rate, which we'll get to in a little bit, this behavior, it doesn't make any sense. Why would someone with such a low metabolic rate waste so much energy just to defecate on the forest floor when their counterpart, the two-toed sloths, readily poop from the canopy? They don't waste this energy. And we'll see that by exhibiting this behavior, it reinforces the algae. And what these researchers hypothesize is that this risky behavior in the three-toed sloth reinforces the algae concentration and microbiome in the sloths and confirms a nutritional benefit. The players involved here are the three-toed sloth that's up here. It's carrying a little cub. The second player, green algae, you can see this sloth, they're normally green, but they're not born this way. They are covered in green fur, and this fur is structurally designed to hold on to the algae and allow it to grow much better. This is a microscopic view of the algae involved. And the third player is the common sloth moth. It's not as common as you think. There's multiple species of sloth moths. But I want to point your attention to the top right, that the back of this sloth is riddled in these moths. There's a ton of them crawling around all the time. So I mentioned that the sloths climb down a tree and this behavior doesn't make any sense. But this behavior is really well documented. And what's actually going on here is that the sloths, or the moths that are living on the sloth fur, hitch a ride down with this sloth once a week. And when they poop, the moths deposit their eggs within the poop, because the larvae are what's called coprophagous, meaning that they use the excrement nutrients to grow and then hatch. Now, upon hatching, they then fly back up to the canopy, find a friendly three-toed sloth, and reside there, reproduce there, and die there. And that's the life cycle of these sloth moths. But I mentioned the metabolic rate. The metabolic rate for the three-toed sloth is 162 kilojoules per day per kilogram. Now, the average weight of a three-toed sloth is about 4 kilograms. And extrapolating that out, we get 648 kilojoules per day that they need to survive on. And in human terms, that's 154 calories. That's as if this sloth is surviving on about 1.5 Reese's peanut butter cups a day, it's ridiculous to me. But this doesn't explain the full story. This does explain the relationship between the sloths and the moths, but not the algae. Why does the three-toed sloth have more algae? So what does this relationship provide? Sloths to the moths, as I just mentioned, they provide a habitat and a reproductive mechanism through hitching a ride down to the bottom, pooping, depositing eggs, going back up. The moth to the algae, we'll see in this study that the moths actually provide elemental nutrients to the algae as in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus. And the algae to the sloth, that's actually unknown. It's been hypothesized that it's camouflage, that it's purely camouflage, but we will see in this study that we're really aiming for a quick nutritional benefit to the sloth at all times. And so first, researchers needed to quantify the moths and algae concentration on the sloths. They took 2- and 3-toed sloths, then they counted the moths on them, and they found an average of 15.2 moths per sloth. They then took the hair samples. They took hair samples from both species of sloth, and they needed to quantify the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus within the hair. They quantified nitrogen through flow injection analyzer, and the phosphorus through this inductively coupled plasma optical emission spectroscopy. This is a very, very similar method to FAAS, flame atomic absorption spectroscopy. Many students might have run across it in analytical chem at Metro. But what this ICP-OES does is it just has a much lower limit of detection than FAAS, because we'll see the concentration of phosphorus is so low in the fur. And then they needed to quantify the algae, and so they took these same hair samples and they separated the cells from the hair via this methanol solution. They then used a fluorometer to fluoresce the chlorophore, and then they used an estimate that 20% of the total sloth mass is just fur. And they used that figure to extrapolate total algae biomass within. In this figure on the right, this top is measuring moth biomass versus 2- and 3-toed sloths in black and gray. More moths in the 3-toed sloth. This second figure is measuring nitrogen in the form of ammonium. Again, more nitrogen in the 3-toed sloths than the 2-toed sloths, and the same pattern for measuring chlorophyll down at the bottom, which we know we can relate to algae biomass, but again, more of each player in the 3-toed sloth. So they needed to actually run some science, and they did through statistical analysis. As they plot moth biomass across the ammonium concentration or available nitrogen, they found as we increase the moths, we increase the nitrogen. Great. Okay, we know more moths means more nitrogen, but what does more nitrogen mean? More nitrogen, on this second figure, we see an increase in chlorophyll and an increase in algae biomass. And through the commutative property, you can see we have more moths, more nitrogen, more algae. So, more moths, more algae. Now, the behavior that's really commonly seen throughout sloths is this self-grooming like a cat. And it can be hypothesized that as they're self-grooming, they are going to ingest some of this algae. And what scientists wanted to see was, are the algae readily able to be digested by the sloth? What nutrients can the algae provide, or do the algae provide to the sloth? And they did this by simulating pregastric fermentation. Sloths being primarily herbivores, the 3-toed sloths eat a very specific diet of 5 to 7 species of leaves. And they simulated this pregastric fermentation that occurs within the sloth to determine the nutrient availability from the digested algae. After they did this, they were left with what's called VFAs, volatile fatty acids. These are an extremely important intermediate within the anaerobic fermentation pathway, which is happening in this pregastric chamber. And so they found this group of 4 first of VFAs in acetic, propionic, butyric, and valeric VFAs. These are 2 to 5 straight carbon chains, and they're primarily from carbohydrate fermentation, suggesting there are a lot of carbohydrates available within the algae that the sloth can ferment and use. They also found that 2 other groups, isobutyric and methylbutyric, these are branch chain fatty VFAs, and these are primarily from amino acid fermentation of those proteins. So I mentioned that because of the presence of these 4 VFAs, that there is definitely a high concentration of carbohydrates available to the sloth. So let's look at 2- and 3-toed sloths first, and total VFAs on the right. We know the 3-toed sloth has more algae, so it's going to produce more VFAs. That's pretty obvious. But let's look at uncleaned versus cleaned fur. Uncleaned meaning having algae, and cleaned not having algae, or much less. In the uncleaned fur, there is triple the amount of VFAs than in the clean fur, suggesting, yes, okay, this confirms the algae does have the available nutrients to the sloths. And I mentioned this hypothesis that the sloths take on algae as they're grooming, but they needed to prove it, obviously. So they took samples from both hair and gastric contents to confirm if that's what they're seeing in the gastric samples. And in figures A and C, these are algae samples from the fur. Figures B and D, these are algae samples from the gastric contents. They found large amounts of algae and also some cyanobacteria within them. And the algae is obviously acquired through this self-grooming. Due to the two previous slides about the VFAs present, it suggests a high nutrient capability or high nutrient availability in the form of carbohydrates at first to the sloth. Scientists also quantify the amount of nutrients within those 5 to 7 species of leaves that the sloths eat. And they found across the board, there was always the algae was always 3 to 5 times richer in lipids than in the preferred leaves by the sloths. And an interesting thing about the lipids is these lipids do not need to go through this pre-fermentation pathway. They go straight through and are available for immediate metabolism. So we're starting to see this algae, okay, yes, it's plausible it does have a nutritional benefit. But I want to break down the three-way mutualism one more time. We have more moths, more nitrogen, more algae, and more algae through these VFAs and the lipids, high nutrient availability to the sloth. But why would the three-toed sloth risk it? Because the two-toed sloth doesn't. The two-toed sloth has a higher metabolism, so one might think, okay, they have more energy, they can make the trek down, they can poop on the ground, get more moths, get more algae, but they don't. They have a lower moth concentration and a lower algae concentration. The three-toed sloths lower metabolism, but they still do this really backwards behavior. They're wasting so much energy. So there must be something reinforcing that wasting of energy. They utilize this high moth concentration by them hitching a ride, depositing in the feces, and then flying back up. They then get more nitrogen, so they have a richer algae concentration, and they have easier access to quick nutrients through this grooming and the VFAs and lipids. So I kind of equate this to like an evolutionary bug, that there's this glitch that demands the three-toed sloth to climb down the tree with these moths so the moths can proliferate, and the sloth provides constant maintenance to the moth concentration. The moths then in turn deposit more nitrogen and phosphorus, I'll mention phosphorus in a second, then that then increases the richness and concentration of the algae. And we know this algae is able to give the sloth many, many nutrients on a moment's notice. It's a three-way mutualism. I said I'd mention phosphorus. What they actually found was that the differences between phosphorus between the two and three-toed sloths was actually it was negligible. And so they stopped talking about nitrogen, or stopped talking about phosphorus, and they really started just to focus on the three-toed sloth. But what does algae actually provide to the three-toed sloth? The common thinking was camouflage, and that makes sense until they climb out of the tree during their most dangerous behavior. Yes, they're camouflaged up in the canopy, the leaves are green, but the ground is brown. During their most dangerous behavior, they're no longer camouflaged. So that's a big reasoning there. And it doesn't account for this pooping behavior, as I just mentioned. And it also doesn't account for the metabolic differences and algae concentration differences between the two and three-toed sloth. That you would think, as I mentioned, the two-toed sloth with a higher metabolism would make the trek and would have higher algae concentration, but it's completely backwards. That the disadvantaged sloth is the one who's risking its life more often just to increase its algae concentration. And so camouflage, it can't be the full story here. What this study is suggesting is that the behavior, this dangerous, risky behavior by the three-toed sloth, climbing down and defecating to reinforce this moth concentration, is actually to the algae's benefit, and in turn the sloth's benefit, purely for a nutritional advantage and survivability. Thank you. Email me with any questions.